I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to start by commending the gentlemen from Florida, both, for their concern about our nation's ongoing military engagements. It's one I share as a veteran of the global war on terror. Unfortunately, there are no silver bullets in policymaking, and when we try to make one, we usually end up shooting ourselves in the foot. It's for this reason and this reason alone I stand in opposition. I've served in Operation Iraqi Freedom as an attack helicopter pilot. And as a combat veteran, Mr. Speaker, I can assure you no one hates war more than those who've come to face with it. I do not look back on the days of American military overreach and intervention in the Middle East with nostalgia. That said, also as a West Point graduate, I understand history and the lessons it teaches. The siren song of isolationism is tempting, but allowing vacuums of American influence around the world to be filled by terrorists and exploited by communists is a direct threat to Americans at home. While each presidential administration has made errors in the conduct of its foreign policy since the tragedies of 9/11 22 years ago, the most egregious of these errors is continuing to concede America's diplomatic leverage and allowing our agricultural, manufacturing, and energy independence to erode. But it's Congress, this body, that has lazily conceded its constitutional duty to guard its war powers jealously from the executive branch. Congress's failure to hold each administration this century accountable for their vague, broad, and failing foreign policies may force Congress to exercise our war powers again in my lifetime. That's why I agree with Mr. Gaetz, in large part, that war should never be on autopilot nor open-ended. Americans have the right, and Congress has the responsibility to understand and approve of the sacrifice that we'll be asking our country to make. Our service members are real people with families. They are sons and daughters. Many weren't even born when 9/11 occurred. Congress needs to do its job, but it needs to do its job the right way. That's why, rather than continuing an open-ended 22-year-old law, I believe we must work together to first replace it with an authorization of use of military force that focuses on today's critical terrorist threats and requires Congress to stay engaged. We must prioritize first building an America that's strong at home, or we will never have a hope of being strong abroad. Regrettably, my friends, today's resolution does little toward those ends. It will merely direct the removal of U.S. forces from Somalia. That will not work. Less than 2 years ago, we saw what happens when we pull troops with no plan. Joe Biden's botched Afghanistan withdrawal forced our troops to abandon billions of dollars in taxpayer-funded military equipment. It resulted in 13 young American service members dead. It left hundreds of thousands of American veterans who served in Afghanistan wondering if their efforts were in vain. It embarrassed America on the world stage and left a gaping hole that China and the Taliban rushed to fill in. What have we learned? The Biden administration responded with the commander-in-chief checking his watch during a dignified transfer of service members killed, and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin claiming he had no regrets about the withdrawal. What have we learned? But lest my argument be debased or derided as petty partisanship, let me flip the script. Mr. Speaker, I ask you, what happened the last time Republicans tried to repeal something without a plan to replace it? I tell you the truth. What happened then will pale in comparison to the consequences of ceding global strategic high ground of the future to those who mean to harm us. I will be the first to argue that we've become over-dependent on the military rather than investing in ourselves, in our industrial base at home, wielding diplomacy, and harnessing economic statescraft as our tools of first resort. There is no global stability when America is economically weak, militarily impulsive, and has a reputation of retreat. The most devastating effect of abandoning our allies, even now, thousands of our fellow Americans on the battlefield is that our friends don't trust us and our enemies no longer fear us. If we want nations around the world to choose America instead of dictators and despots, we must give them a reason to do so. This premature withdrawal from Somalia will be a great victory for a dangerous al-Qaeda affiliate that seeks the death of America. There's another group of adversaries to keep in mind as well. Russia and the Communist Party of China would like nothing more than to see the U.S. take a foreign policy of isolationism. There's already a Chinese military base on the east coast of Djibouti. There are reports of more coming to the west coast of Africa, which will pose a direct threat to America. If we cavalierly withdraw from Africa, the CCP will rush to fill in the void like they did in Afghanistan. By emboldening terrorists, Russia and Communist China, this resolution would harm the national security of the United States. Again, Mr. Speaker, I applaud the gentleman from Florida initiative for forcing this long overdue debate. I also applaud leadership for allowing it to come to the floor. I invite the gentleman to work with me to end this executive overreach of over 2 decades, to pull back our war powers and Article I authority under the Constitution in a way that truly puts America first. But as it stands today, regretfully, this resolution will not strengthen America at home or keep her safe abroad. It is for that reason, and again, that reason alone, that I urge my colleagues to join me in opposition. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to the House Concurrent Resolution 30. This resolution was drafted in such a way that it is simultaneously overbroad and under-inclusive. The resolution fails to end our involvement in hostilities in the region while preventing crucial security cooperation with local partners in Somalia. The resolution states that the United States forces must withdraw from Somalia unless they are for the purposes of protecting the embassy. Historically, war powers resolutions such as this are thought of as attempting to force the president to withdraw American troops from a foreign country that are actively engaged in combat. But our forces on the ground in Somalia are there to provide security training and intelligence support. Our footprint in Somalia is not large. We have several hundred troops stationed in the country, primarily to train host nation troops in countering terrorism. The sponsor of this legislation sometimes references the lost blood and treasure from our overseas engagements. These are obviously essential considerations. It is why I supported President Biden's decision to end the war in Afghanistan. But no American has been killed in Somalia in over 4 years, and our security cooperation and assistance to the country amounts to a rounding error in the federal budget. It is a fact that al-Shabaab and other terrorist organizations like ISIS control large swaths of territory in Somalia. But local forces from the Somalia government and the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia have made steady gains, yes, steady gains, the past several years. United States forces have been instrumental in some of these changes because of the very training and intelligence support we provide to local forces on the ground. By mandating that our forces cease security cooperation in Somalia, this resolution would roll back some of the gains that have been made to take back territory from terrorist organizations in the past several years. This measure doesn't end American hostilities in the region. It includes nothing about removing American forces from other nations in the region where groups like al-Shabaab operate, and it does nothing to address over-the-horizon strikes. While I disagree with this measure, let me say, and what I do agree with, that we are having this debate. It is one that is long overdue. American forces have been in Somalia and other parts of the world without proper engagement from the United States Congress. And while I understand the logic that both Republican and Democratic administrations have used to include groups like al-Shabaab under the 2001 AUMF, I can tell you that members of Congress did not believe that they were authorizing force against al-Shabaab when we passed the legislation decades ago. I can tell you this not just because I was here when Congress voted on that AUMF, but because al-Shabaab didn't even exist in September 2001. I believe, though, that the proper way to address the issues of matters of war and peace in Somalia is not through a legally dubious resolution such as this. I agree with Representative James in this, and we should work together, all three of us, I believe, because the right way to address this issue is through a repeal of the 2001 AUMF and its replacement with a narrow force authorization that provides the President authority to combat selected terrorists in selected countries where the United States national security is at stake. Fact of the matter, Mr. Speaker, I have introduced just such a resolution, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on that. H.J. Res 52, which narrows the list of terrorist organizations the executive branch can strike, limits the number of countries in which we could engage in hostilities, places curbs on the executive branch additions of associated forces and successor groups, and includes a sunset requiring Congress to reauthorize the legislation, reasserting Congress's proper role over matters of war and peace, while ensuring that the President has the necessary authorities to strike those who mean to do us harm, can be and is a tough balance to strike. But I believe wholeheartedly it is our responsibility to make some of those hard decisions. We cannot punt it or give it off just to the executive. And I believe, and I'm willing to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to strike a balance. Let's take a look at H.J. Res 52, because from the debate we're having today, I think that we have some of the basics of what we agree with. That is this body, that the Constitution empowered to make sure there's a check and balance on the executive. So, unfortunately, I can't say that about H.Con. Res 30 before us today. And so, therefore, I must oppose this legislation, urge my colleagues to do the same, and let's come together as members of the United States House of Representatives and take our responsibility. Let's repeal and replace the 2001 AUMF and move forward. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Florida. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
It is a great honor to participate in this debate with my esteemed colleague, Mr. Meeks of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and with a great patriot such as Mr. James of Michigan. I want to welcome the American people to the second part in a legislative series we are conducting about all of the places on the planet Earth where Congress still believes that 9/11 justifies current U.S. troop presence in 2023. And the first in that series was Syria. And I came to this floor, only got about 103 votes, but I made the argument that our troops were essentially sitting ducks, guarding oil extraction operations where their presence was known, where their location was easily identifiable, and I called for a withdrawal.
That withdrawal was defeated. And then precisely what I predicted, more U.S. casualties from Iranian drones. That's what happened. Exactly what I said would occur. And it is with no joy I say that. And I know all of us would take any policy position we could to reduce U.S. casualties. And I think this debate will present an excellent opportunity to reflect on Somalia in that light. There are currently 900 U.S. troops in Somalia, give or take, and this resolution would bring them home. Somalia is a country of 17 million, tortured at times by al-Shabaab, a group of roughly 7,000 hardened fighters and even more sympathizers. But to believe any of the arguments, just logically, that my colleagues are making, you have to believe that 900 U.S. troops is what is going to save a country of 17 million from a hardened group of 7,000. I think that strains not only logic, but our understanding of the history of Somalia, a country that has oscillated between failed state and just absolute coup revolution over and over again, civil war, sectarian violence. The future of Somalia must be determined by Somalia. And to the extent that foreign influences could be helpful, I would argue that the African Union is far better positioned to build a stronger sense of national identity and national unity among clans that have been warring in Somalia for generations than U.S. troops. I have yet to see the evidence that U.S. troops are the essential element to fusing relationships among warring African warlords, clans, and tribes. Now, the Brits controlled Somalia, and in nearly half the century since, we have seen a constant state of despair. So what is the end state for our military presence in Somalia? Are we going to be the block captain of Mogadishu, presumably forever, until we beat the last sympathy for al-Shabaab out of the last heart of the last Somali? That was the argument with Syria and ISIS. We have to stay in Syria because there's still people who believe the ISIS ideology. Mr. Speaker, I would argue that the U.S. military is not an effective capability to deploy to defeat an ideology. We are not able to permanently stabilize countries by having a presence that can at times be a very basis for the terrorism recruitment that we seem to work against. There is also an opportunity cost to being in Somalia that I would like to share with the body. I represent constituents who are part of these missions, these train, equip, and advise missions throughout Africa. And increasingly, they're having to enter the Indo-PACOM to get analysis and research on the best communication skills and tactical skills and strategic skills that would be necessary if conflict were to erupt in the Indo-PACOM theater. And what I have observed firsthand is that at times, some of our best and brightest are having to go split squad, where some are wandering about Africa on train and equip missions, and then there's less of a focused capability in places where I think America must hold the high ground to ensure the enduring success of our nation. My colleague from the other side of the aisle made mention of the training that America does in Africa and how critical it is. The problem is, far too often we are training the next generation of coup leaders. We haven't figured that out yet. I got to ask questions of the leader of AFRICOM, why so many people who are leading coups in Africa were trained by Americans. He was unable to identify even current leaders of African countries, that they were trained by Americans or that they participated in coups. I would now seek unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, to enter into the record a piece from The Intercept. AFRICOM Chief to Congress, we share core values with coup leaders.
Without objection.
And in this piece, it highlights 5 countries, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, Mauritania, and Gambia, where the very people who led the coups were the people that had received this training from the United States. I would note that any comparison here to Afghanistan is sorely misplaced. This legislation provides 1 year to remove 900 people. That is far different than unwinding the double helix that was our multi-decade engagement with Afghanistan. I agree with the sentiment that my colleague Mr. James stated, that our friends must trust us and our enemies must fear us. But what I have observed after 20 years of American war in the Middle East, in North Africa, is that our enemies often mock us when we try to be the world's policeman and the world's piggy bank. That is not the goal, should be the goal of our country. We should not be engaged in nation building in Somalia, in the Middle East, or elsewhere. These 900 U.S. troops have no end state. They are engaging in largely police force operations. I suggest they should come home, and a vote for this resolution would do that. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with my colleague, Mr. Gaetz. A series of great points. The greatest, I believe, is a military cannot be used to fight an ideology. Unlimited war without checking on Congress is unconstitutional, and we must come up with a better solution, which is why House Foreign Affairs, as the chairman on the subcommittee in Africa, we recognize the DoD doesn't exist in a vacuum. We recognize that the State Department and USAID are present in building civilian leaders and institutions. We understand these institutions must work together with different mandates, and we're not shooting our way out of Somalia. We must provide additional ways to fix the problem. And so I agree we cannot fight ideology with military, and I look forward to working with all sides to figure out exactly how we can strengthen our ties to make sure that we have partners and move from aid to trade with a long-term partner. I believe we had a rousing speech from the president of South Korea just an hour ago, where he mentioned the great aid that the United States taxpayers and the great investment that we've made over decades and years in South Korea. And now, as a shining example, they are the 10th most wealthy country in the world because of America, our great generosity, and because we are exceptional. I think we have a remarkable opportunity to do that and show that America truly should be the first choice and first option for folks around the world. Mr. Speaker, with that, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Zinke.
Is recognized. 3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition, but I agree with my distinguished colleagues from Florida that Congress has an obligation to review it. Congress should not abrogate our responsibility. We should ask the tough questions. And ultimately, we should provide the funding necessary and the resources to win. That's our job, and I agree with you 100%. But as a commander, they are doing more than just guarding an embassy. A force structure of 900 may seem like a large footprint, but those of us who remember Black Hawk Down would suggest otherwise. A force requires medevac. Those medevac require people that service those aircraft. In case we get in trouble, we need a quick reaction force, a force large enough to defend our troops. Because I, and like my colleagues, know that if you were to put any American servicemen in harm's way, we want to ensure we have the adequate force to make sure they're recovered safely. They also have to be fed. Communications. In order to have an effective force, you need a footprint that can do its mission. What I also agree with is that we should have a plan. Before we unplug our obligations, we should know what unplugging it does and when, and also we should have a plan on what our obligations are. So much of this discussion is a discussion among similar views. We do have an obligation for freedom. We have a commitment to democracy. That when we provide a force to defend that democracy, and it is American force and our allies, that we provide them with a force package that can win. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I ask my colleagues to oppose this well-intended amendment and resolution. But I do ask that we work as a body to uphold our duty as Congress to make sure that the authorizations we give the executive are both appropriate, timely, and do so to win. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Michigan reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say, this debate is long overdue. And we happen to be talking about the AUMF. But it's especially, and I would hope that we end up having more debates on this floor, talking about the continent of Africa, who has long been left off the debate floor of the United States Congress, which is a continent that we've got to focus on. I look forward to working with Mr. James as the chair of that subcommittee. And the stability of Africa, the stability of its governments and its institutions. Because if we don't, it's at our own danger. And we should be doing it because it's the right thing. And we should be listening to those allies that we have on the continent and to those presidents. Because they are the ones that are at threat and in danger of being destroyed by terrorist groups who have now moved over the continent. So we got to have this debate more and more and make sure that Africa is on our front burner, not our back burner. Because if Africa continues to be on our back burner, we will see Russia and China, as Mr. James has indicated and others, jumping in. We will see Wagner coming in to secure these countries. So let's have this debate. And with that, I proudly yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman who came to the United States from the continent of Africa and now from the great state of Minnesota, Ilhan Omar.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of House Resolution 30, the Somalia War Powers Resolution. I agree with the Chairman, a real debate about U.S. policy in Somalia and in Africa is long overdue. It's debate that should include a serious discussion of our long-term strategy for supporting stability and self-governance. It should include clear-eyed analysis of U.S. counterterrorism policies, including airstrikes and drones, and the consistent problem of civilian casualties of U.S. operations. Congress is also overdue for a debate about the expansive use of the 2001 AUMF, which the executive branch claims includes operations in Somalia. Mr. Speaker, the resolution before the House today does not address these significant issues. It is a narrow question of withdrawing few hundred troops. Given President Hassan's renewed efforts to eradicate al-Shabaab, the resolution does include a long enough timeline to ensure the operations that we are partnering with can be ended responsibly. While we should not mistake this poorly crafted resolution for an honest assessment of U.S. policy on Somalia, it is important that we support the question before us. I and many Somali Americans support this resolution, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can assure the gentleman from New York that we will have a more fulsome discussion regarding the continent of Africa, because the next in our legislative series may very well be Niger. And so we'll have that opportunity as well. And to my colleague from Minnesota, I think she really hits the nail on the head that the partnerships between the existing government in Somalia and the clans that exist throughout the country is the essential glue to resist the violence and destabilization that we see from al-Shabaab. It is my belief that the government's entrees to those groups to get them to not side with al-Shabaab are not facilitated by extensive U.S. presence. I just don't believe that to get one group of Somalis to stop killing another group of Somalis, that the essential ingredient is us. And it may be other African influencers to a positive extent, but there's great wisdom in what the gentlelady shared regarding the utility of those partnerships and relationships. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would yield 6 minutes to my colleague from Florida, Mr. Mills.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to my distinguished colleague from Florida, Mr. Gaetz. And I also want to thank my colleagues, Mr. James and Mr. Zinke, for they, like myself, are combat veterans who understand the total cost of warfare. Now, before I get into my statement, I want to address a couple of things that was made by my colleagues here today. We talked about the idea that we are here to preserve freedoms and we are here to preserve democracy. But let's talk about our role in democracy. When we went into Iraq in 2003 under the auspice that we were there for weapons of mass destruction and to liberate the people of Iraq, only 2 years later did we supplement this with the 2005 Iraq Constitution, whereby Article 76, in its own design, created sectarian democracy that gave rise to the Iranian control, which ultimately gave rise to China's domination. You know, we are not a nation-building element. We are war fighters. We are there to conduct counterterrorism operations when needed, but only at the expense that it is to the benefits of the American national security and U.S. interests. Now, he talked about timely, but I ask you, Mr. Speaker, we started our operations in Mogadishu in the early 90s. We started the operations in Afghanistan in 2001. We started the operations in Iraq in 2003. So by what definition do we determine is timely? You know, the idea that my colleague, and rightfully so, and I agree with him, Mr. James, said about the repeal and replace piece of the AUMF, which I do view as an abdication of our roles and responsibilities as legislators under the Constitution in Article 1, Clause 8. But it does have a replacement, and I just stated it, and it's called the United States Constitution War Authorities. At no point in time can you find in the Constitution whereby it says we can repeal our rights as legislators under the Constitution to put in something which abdicates our roles and responsibilities for 20-plus years on an AUMF that was designed and now being abused by presidents on the left and the right who have been using it for its non-intended purposes. And while I agree with my colleague, Mr. Gaetz, that Afghanistan is completely not relevant to the discussion that was made, we're talking about an area whereby President Biden utilized political optics over military strategy, endangering the lives of our military when we know that it was a conditions-based withdrawal. But one thing was actually stated as correct, which is the threat in which China possesses when it comes to the Africa continent, and that a vacuum could be created. But let's go ahead and focus on what China's ultimate goal is, because it is not kinetics. It is not about the bomb-to-bomb, gun-to-gun, or bullet-to-bullet mechanism. It is about the economic and resource warfare impact. It is about the Belt and Road Initiative, which expands out the Eurasian border, takes over Africa, Oceania, cuts off Western Hemisphere supply chain, in an effort to utilize the WHO, WEF, and OPEC to eliminate the US dollar from the global currency. So let's address that issue, which is not one that is done by kinetics and warfighters, but by a whole-of-nation approach that deals with treasury, that deals with the economic build-out, that deals with strengthening the industrial base at home, that stops the reliance on the very adversaries that we pay to slap us around every day. And this idea that we're going to play this terrorist whack-a-mole, where every time one pops up we send a new force, does nothing to actually try and help with stabilization. And let's talk about our interactions. We had a terrorist organization known as the Al-Qaeda Arabian Peninsula that was based in a small portion in the Gulf of Aden, out in Yemen. And it wasn't until our drone strikes that caused numerous civilian casualties that did we not play right into the ideology that Americans are here to destroy us and kill us due to our religious beliefs. We were actually the reason that Al-Qaeda Arabian Peninsula continued to grow. And my colleague on the left, who I have a great deal of respect for, and we sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Meeks, he talks about the fact that we've had no Americans killed in Somalia, but that's absolutely false. And in fact, we just had another soldier killed in 2018 as a result of an explosion that resulted in 3 more. And also in 2017, where we had 3 more killed, that was there. You know, as someone who has had to go visit Arlington Cemetery on many occasions to see my brothers that are no longer here with me today, I don't think that we need to spare one more life of American bloodshed in an effort that we don't have a clear strategic military objective to begin with. And so I ask that we look at not being isolationists, as we're always called and considered, but also not interventionists. Our goal is to be protectionists, protection of our constitutional rights, our sovereignty, and the American people. That is our role. And we keep talking about this 2001 AUMF that we were to repeal. Well, let's go through this. In 2019, the amendment to the 2020 NDA to repeal the 2002 AUMF was stripped out in its final version. In November 14th of 2018, the resolution introduced to assert Congress's war power authorities in Yemen, the Rules Committee stripped the resolution in its procedural privilege. And then soon after, the Rules Committee stripped privilege from all war power resolutions for the remainder of the 115th Congress. We keep talking about what we're going to do, but I've seen very little action. And see, this is one of the reasons that I ran for Congress, because there's too many politicians who like to talk and not enough statesmen who are willing to act. And I know a little thing about action, considering that between my military and government experience, I've spent over 7 years of my life in Iraq, almost 3 years of my life in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Pakistan, and guess what? Northern Somalia and the Puntland areas of Hargeisa and Berbera. I can tell you very clearly that what we are doing right now in our procedures is not making us safer, and we must start to look at a real change in order to try and protect America, stop abdicating our roles and responsibilities, and start leading from the front. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Florida reserves. Gentleman from Michigan.
I think this is what we call violent agreement. We need to fix the ills of the past with a solution for the future. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCormick.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is one of my favorite debates. It's in my short time in Congress and even in observing Congress where you have people from both sides of the aisle actually taking opposition to each other so we can have a real conversation. People that I respect on my side of the aisle and people that both I respect and disagree with on the other side of the aisle, having a real debate that has little to do with partisanship, but really about principle. It's refreshing. I thought, much like H.R. 21, which was probably the most fascinating vote we've taken to the date since I've been in Congress, where you actually had somebody, a Republican, somebody whose credentials as a conservative are not questioned at all, had more people from the Democrat Party vote for his bill than the Republican Party. He had the squad vote for him and his bill. That's bipartisanship in a certain way. And yet we have this debate right now in a similar fashion on Somalia. And this is not a place that's unknown to me. I was there during part of the UN withdrawal in '94 off the coast on the 15 Marine Expeditionary Unit. I spent time in Entebbe, Uganda as part of Operation Restore Hope when we had our problem with Rwanda. Africa is a place of many troubled nations, no doubt about it. The question we have today is, what's good for America? This isn't about nation building. This is about protecting our nation. This is a debate over whether we're going to save lives or lose lives that are American by what our actions are in the near future and into the future of how we plan our force structure and what we deploy with around the world. I'm very much concerned that if we're not in these regions, especially in Somalia, which is one of the most war-torn areas we know of, that we'll have an increase in terrorist activities. When you see a country like Afghanistan and the way it's deteriorated, now you have 27 terrorist cells training there because of a lack of presence of good guys trying to make sure that bad guys don't propagate and proliferate and make sure that they're recruiting people and sending people over here to do harm to us. It's a minor miracle that we haven't had another 9/11 in so long. If you think about it, the incredible work that we've had done by our intel community and our special forces and other Americans around the world to circumvent that from happening is nothing short of Herculean. And I would make the case that because we have forces all around the world, we have been a safer place. We have saved American lives. And this isn't about building a nation of 17 million people. This is about protecting a nation of 330 million people. I want to make sure that we're clear in this argument, that this is not about seeking war. Anybody who spent time in the military, I spent over 20 years in the military myself. I spent years away from my family as well. I've served with 3 different forces, the Marine Corps, Army, and Navy. Nobody wants war less than I do. Nobody wants to see Americans killed more than any military commander. And as a matter of fact, when we send these people, it's not because a politician wants to go over there. Usually it's because a general or an area commander has requested these troops in collaboration with each other, and we're talking about decades of experience in the region, and they understand what's at stake. They don't want war. They don't want American troops to lose their lives. As a matter of fact, they are judged historically on how many American lives they save, on how many American troops that they don't put in harm's way. This isn't about seeking war. This is about avoiding war. This isn't about protecting their nation. It's protecting our nation. We have an obligation to watch over this great nation of ours. I think it's not by pulling back, but engaging other countries in a way that we can work together to protect American lives, both civilian and military. And with that, I yield.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Michigan reserves. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, messages from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed S-1311, an act to reauthorize the Morris K. Udall and Stuart L. Udall Trust Fund and for other purposes in which concurrence of the House is requested.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me just say, Mr. Mills, that I just want to make sure that when I talked about we had not lost any deaths in Somalia, I said in the last 4 years, acknowledging what happened before, but in the last 4 years, we have not lost any American troops in Somalia. Let me also say that, as I said earlier, that I am happy that we're having this debate and talking about the continent of Africa. And if we do that, we've got to listen to the I can just recall, and sometimes many of my colleagues, especially on the other side of the aisle, argue that we don't get the votes we need at times in the UN from African countries. I recall when we were trying to get votes in regards to Russia's illegal invasion into Ukraine. And I had to call African ambassadors. And they said, now you're calling me? We haven't heard from the United States for a while. Now you want something from me? We've been asking for assistance in regards to security. And then I watched to see what was taking place when we look at our diplomacy. It was over 2 decades it took before in the 117th Congress we passed a state authorization bill and had to do that through the NDAA as opposed to saying we're going to stand strongly on diplomacy. Guess what China did during that period of time? They doubled their diplomacy budget. Guess what else is happening? For the first time, China has more consulates than the United States of America. General Kelly said either we do and get engaged in more diplomacy or you're going to have to spend more money on bullets. We have an opportunity to engage and listen to allies and work with our allies. Many allies who have more and should have more responsibility on the continent because they colonized it, working with us collectively to try to make sure that the Chinas and the Russias of the world are not invested and we are invested and we are not. It's our challenge. And I hope that when we get past this debate, you'll be able to have another one. And I look forward to doing it particularly in our committee so that we can figure out collectively together, as Ms. Ilhan said, how we can work together and listen to make sure that we have an overall strategy. And I say this in regards to both parties. I say this to the administration, who should be doing more on the continent of Africa. So yes, this is not a partisan debate. This is an American debate. This is an opportunity to have attention to a continent that is the fastest growing and the youngest on this planet, that we have ignored for far too long. We have to wake up and do more for the continent of Africa and figure it out. Diplomacy. Figure out how we can help protect them from being victimized by terrorism. Figure out how we can strengthen institutions. We've got a lot of work to do. Figure out how do we reauthorize AGOA. Figure out how we work with the African Union. Figure out how we work with the African organizations. That's our challenge. Because if not, we imperil ourselves. So I could agree, this is not just an investment in the continent, it's an investment for America and America's leadership. Let's lead. And with that, I'm happy to yield 2.5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, the Honorable Representative Sheila Jackson Lee.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
Let me thank the gentleman for his distinguished leadership and the manager on this floor, and certainly the proponent of this resolution. I know it came with good intentions, but let me indicate the wiseness of a young college student some many years ago when I offered to my college for my winning traveling fellowship that I would go to the continent of Africa. Everyone else would go to places well-defined and well-recognized. But I told them that I wanted to take the fellowship that I'd received to travel to West Africa, and I did. From then, Togo and Dahomey obviously changed names to Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana and Nigeria, and studied, seeing the potential even then. And I am gratified to be in this Congress, to be able to have the leadership of our chairman, our ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, to recognize the cruciality of our purpose on the continent. It was members of the Congressional Black Caucus that organized to say how important it was under the George W. Bush administration that an Africa Command would be set up. It was crucial in the bloody fight in Liberia for that command to be set up, and only without shooting one gun were they able to begin to bring peace. And so I rise with great concern and opposition to Conres 30, because I realize the importance of the Africa Command, because it has as elements of it diplomacy. And I am glad that President Biden reversed Trump's get out of town and get out of Dodge quick resolution to, in fact, leave a footprint of 500 that are helping us bring down al-Shabaab, bring down al-Qaeda, and boost up the Somalian partners of which our soldiers are working through and working to degrade al-Shabaab's ability to plot external operations while building the capacities of our partner. The rest of Africa is watching. If they try to be peaceful and to stand up a democratic entity, do they have a powerful force like the United States? I, too, want a full debate on the authorization to use military force. I have been here for 9/11 and all afterwards. And I, too, believe that is our duty. But what I will say at this time, we should not remove those troops from Somalia. I'd ask my colleague to join with his committee and engage in debate on the AUMF, but I want to protect the Somalian people, Africa, and I want to protect the interests of democracy and the United States of America. With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If what it takes to protect the 17 million people in Somalia is 900 U.S. troops forever, I don't have high hopes for them. I have far more confidence in the strategy that Congresswoman Omar laid out, which was the Somali government working to create some sense of national identity among Somali clans. And no one has made a compelling argument that we are essential to that process. I take some exception to my colleague from Texas calling this a get-out-quick resolution. It gives us a year. We can't move 900 people in a year? My colleague from Georgia said that he argued that Somali troop presence was essential to keep America safe. Let me be clear. I fear China. I fear some crazy Russian general with nuclear codes far more than I fear Somali warlords fighting over who controls aid streams. And it's not just my opinion. It's the opinion of our military leaders at AFRICOM. It was Brigadier General Bailey who said recently, quote, "What we've seen is not necessarily holding land or territory, more extortion, closer to an organized crime organization." That was on February 27th, 2023, on Nightly News with Lester Holt. So even General Bailey doesn't view this as a way to get land and seize land and keep it away from al-Shabaab. He's saying that they're not really holding land. They're just engaged in low-level thuggery. And it seems unworthy of this sustained U.S. troop presence. So let's make clear, while the debate was elegant and compelling about the need to engage Africa, that the vote on this resolution is whether 900 U.S. troops should stay in Somalia or come home. And those who vote against my resolution are functionally taking the position that the 2001 AUMF, which was voted on when 89% of us who are currently in the House were not even here to vote on it, which was voted on before al-Shabaab even existed. And it has become a global permission slip for U.S. interventionism everywhere. Al-Shabaab had nothing to do with 9/11. The fact that they have co-branded with al-Qaeda is not indicative of any interoperability. And the principal goal of al-Shabaab, like as we're evaluating whether or not we have to keep 900 troops in Somalia for the safety and security of Americans, the principal goal of al-Shabaab is to rule Greater Somalia under Sharia law and overthrow the government. That's not my opinion. That's a February 2023 Congressional Research Service conclusion. That very same CRS report indicates that al-Shabaab does not have the capability to attack the United States. So I guess it's easy to stand up and say we should be the police force everywhere because anywhere some bad person could harbor the desire to kill us. But the best research we have says that that is not in line with their existing capabilities. And, Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to enter that February 2023 Congressional Research Service report into the congressional record. Moreover, we are seeing the government in Somalia achieve gains in large part because of local discontent with al-Shabaab. Because of climate change, we are not seeing the same amount of agricultural and livestock opportunities for people in Somalia. And so many of the groups that were paying extortion money to al-Shabaab are not able to pay it anymore because a lot of the land is dried up. And that resulted in al-Shabaab being incredibly brutal to those local clans and tribes. They poisoned the water. They killed family members. They publicly executed people. And then what happened was a lot of those local tribes pushed back and said, you know what, we'd rather align with the government. And so that's not a victory delivered at the end of a U.S. missile or weapon. That is a victory that is occurring as a consequence of the conditions in Somalia and the choices that Somalis are making. Finally, Mr. Speaker, for this round of debate, I'd like to enter into the record the ACLED piece that details how the government is making gains in grounds and al-Shabaab is losing them. It's entitled Somalia Counterinsurgency Operations Gains Regional Support in Phase 2 as al-Shabaab Attacks and Political Differences Persist.
Without objection.
And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would yield 2 minutes to my colleague from Florida for any comments he may have.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for yielding those 2 minutes. Look, I wanted to approach a couple of things here. You know, we keep talking about the idea that our presence, this 900 people in Somalia, is somehow leading to a stabilization effort. But the reality is this. When was our actual presence required for stabilization as opposed to counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operational tactics? You know, we talk about the threats that are the real threats, which is China, and it's existential to all of us. But we allowed them to go into Ghana, into the Ashanti Belt, and completely pillage resources with no U.S. response. Now, where was our 900 troops that was there to help with this stabilization when our greatest adversary was there robbing and pillaging? And oh, by the way, where are we with regards to if we're there to fight and combat al-Shabaab, then why are we not taking a greater presence when it comes to the oil resource protection in Lake Turkana out in Kenya, a place that I know very well because I spent time in Nairobi and also in Karen? You know, we continue to try and act as if we're stabilizers, but do we not remember what took place in Libya, where we actually helped with supporting the destabilization that now has led to the Misrata militia, the Sirte militia, further economic turmoil? You can't point to a single agenda, whether it was Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, whether it was Libyan support. You can't point to a single one where our presence has actually led to greater stability. But what it has led to is more U.S. lives being lost, more economic deficiency for America, more of us trying to be the world's police and creating more adversaries and enemies throughout the world stage. So again, I continue to ask the same question to every one of my colleagues on the left and the right. How does our presence actually strengthen us from stabilization, provide us stronger allies, give us the actual economic strength that we need to outpace China, who is our greatest existential threat? And how does this 2001 AUMF that is being misused, abused for an open carte blanche of warfare support America's goals? With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida reserves. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the President of the United States.
Madam Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I am directed by the President of the United States to deliver to the House of Representatives a message in writing.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
So again, I believe we're in violent agreement. The gentleman from Georgia mentioned, I believe, and it's extremely appropriate, this isn't about protecting another nation, it's about protecting ours. Today, I think that we're just standing here, and I think if we were to take the vote on the floor, I'm pretty sure that most of our colleagues would agree that the executive branch is abusing its power, and we have ceded, as Congress, have ceded our constitutional authority to hold them to account. We should absolutely hold the executive branch account for their 2 decades of missteps. But me and a number of my colleagues in the freshman class have been here but a mere 110 days. And I'm sure I can speak for most of us that we refuse to be held bound to the mistakes of the past. But we are inspired and excited to make sure that we correct those mistakes of the past with strong policy to benefit the American people and our allies in the future. That requires not repealing something without a replacement. That requires the executive branch coming to us for permission, as they are constitutionally obligated to do, and it is our duty to retain these authorities, but not proceeding without an event-based strategy rather than a time-based strategy. Again, regrettably, I'll restate, this resolution does nothing toward those ends. It merely directs the removal of U.S. forces from Somalia within a time frame, without regard for what may be going on the ground. Again, I applaud and appreciate forcing this debate, long overdue, and I respect and thank the gentleman, Representative Mills, for his service, and Representative Gaetz for forcing this very important debate. I'm looking forward to taking this up with the help of my friend, Mr. Meeks, in House Foreign Affairs, to make sure that we can satisfy our obligation first to the American people and also to our allies who count on us to take up the mantle and use the global leadership not to be isolationist and also not to be imperialist, but to make sure that we are staying strong at home first. Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers and have the right to close, so I will continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
I, too, have no further speakers.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
I would inquire as to my remaining time.
Gentleman has 19 and a half minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to respond to the argument of my colleague from Michigan. He says that our withdrawals must be events-based rather than time-based. I would ask, what events are we waiting for in Somalia exactly? Are we waiting for a Jeffersonian democracy to emerge there? Are we waiting for the sectarian violence that is dominated to automatically just dissolve into the sands? Are we waiting for some other foreign power? I would suggest that in many of these places, what we're actually waiting for is for these countries to take care of themselves and to demonstrate their own capabilities. Because the only way you form a nation is if your own fellow countrymen fight for and win that peace. That's how you develop national heroes like those we see throughout this great capital that is what a nation makes. A nation is not a bunch of Europeans drawing lines in Africa and then saying, this is what's what. We did that after the Second World War, and it's why Africa's been in some degree of turmoil since. And I would continue to present to the body that the government in Somalia is actually on the upswing. They are gaining territory. They are unifying people, and it is not as a consequence of U.S. presence. I would again seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a piece from the International Crisis Group, Sustaining Somalia's Offensive Against Al-Shabaab, and it is from 21 March 2023.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no further speakers and reserve and am prepared to close.
The gentleman's the first to close. Gentleman reserved. Gentleman yield back.
No, I want to close. So I'll.
Gentleman's
if
recognized.
I'm recognized to close. Very well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We must continue to bring to this floor areas in the world where U.S. troops are present, where there is no clear end game, where there is not an end state that is clearly achievable. What our generation has learned as a consequence of observing the great patriotism expressed by many of my colleagues who participated in this debate today is that we don't have the ability to beat an ideology out of anyone. We don't have an ability to go into these places that oftentimes have been riddled with bloodshed and violence and somehow convince them that a democracy or a parliamentary system is more beneficial than the greed that has been driving them for far too long. That is the story of the Middle East. That is the story of North Africa. And if my constituents have to go to Somalia and Syria, then I think everyone here should have to vote one way or the other. And I don't expect to win that vote. But I was expecting probably during this discussion to maybe hear a little bit more about what is it that we expect these people to do in Somalia to ultimately get them out. What we've heard is some version of the argument that we got to fight them over there so we don't fight them over here, even though all the evidence in the record suggests that they don't have the capability to even strike us here. And that the harboring of terrorism that seems to justify the 2001 AUMF permission slip for American intervention, that in no way relates to the activities, capabilities, goals, ambitions of this particular group. What this group wants to do is they want to be able to overthrow the government in Somalia and orient Greater Somalia under their Sharia law. And they're losing in that fight. And what we see online, what many of us have received in briefings in Congress, is that when U.S. troops are present, that serves as a propaganda vehicle for a lot of these groups to be able to go out and recruit and add folks to their ranks. And that is certainly not what we want to see. And if the African Union had a greater role, if the African Union stepped up and worked to fill that vacuum with greater credibility with particular partners and particular localized clans, then that might achieve this objective in the absence of the death and the danger and the deployment that has got our military spread far too thin for far too long. I heard in my colleague's opening that we have to reject the siren song of isolationism. I would observe that globalism is no lullaby. It is often soaked in blood, mired in civil war and violence, and resulting in worse conditions than we found ourselves in. There are 17 million Somalis. I'm rooting for them. I hope that when my life ends, Somalia isn't synonymous with famine and failed states and civil wars and coups. I really hope that. But we must also exercise sufficient humility in this body to understand the capabilities of persuasion for a relatively small batch of American troops given the problem set. And I would return to the argument that I made earlier in this discussion. There is an opportunity cost to this in people. There are specific units that call my district home that are having to split between AFRICOM and INDOPACOM when the reality is whether or not our children are speaking Mandarin, our grandchildren are having to get dominated by the Chinese Communist Party is not going to be the result of who wins the Battle of Mogadishu. It's going to be the result of who holds the high ground against our true-pacing adversaries. And becoming the neighborhood block captain of Somalia is certainly not the behavior of a serious country engaged in very serious challenges against serious adversaries. I thank my colleagues for their indulgence. I certainly thank the leadership for permitting me such time, and I would yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume for the purposes of closing.
Gentleman's recognized.
In closing, I again oppose this resolution because it is not an effective or constitutionally sound approach to resolving the war powers questions in Somalia that many of us here are in fact looking to address. This resolution will harm U.S. interests in the Horn of Africa and make the American people less safe. To my colleagues who are serious about asserting Congress's constitutional role on issues of war and peace, let me say this. I have some encouragement from this debate, that we will have further debates on talking about Congress's responsibility. I look forward to joining with the gentleman from Florida, when I heard him talk about how climate change is affecting many of the areas on the continent. Look forward to working with you in that regards. Look forward to working with you and hope that we can get the Speaker to bring over the repeal of the AUMF of 2002 that the Senate recently has voted on, that we passed 2 years ago in the 117th Congress. So I come out of here looking at some areas of which we can work collectively on. And I urge you to join me, to let's talk and work so that we can repeal and replace the 2001 AUMF with a narrower and time-bound scope. The issues we are discussing here today are pressing and relevant, but there is a better approach. I look forward to undertaking that approach with both of my colleagues on the floor and all of my colleagues on a bipartisan basis, and hope that we will have this conversation and work closely together. Let me also make a correction. I gave credit to General Kelly on the statement of, if we don't put more money into diplomacy, we've got to spend more on bullets. That was General James Mattis. So I want to make sure I give proper credit to the appropriate person in our military. So let's work together. I think we have a real window of opportunity. You know, just listening to the president of South Korea, who just gave a wonderful speech here. He talked about how we won World War II and the Korean War together with our allies, saving democracies, putting our values first. Let's do it. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this resolution, and then let's work together in a bipartisan manner, particularly to help the continent of Africa. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentleman's recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, again, the gentleman from Florida, both of them are very well intentioned on this resolution today. And I firmly agree that Congress must reassert its Article I constitutional responsibility to declare war. This body must replace the 22-year-old counterterrorism AUMF with an authorization that focuses specifically on the threats that we face today. And yes, it must be both time and event-based, because frankly, I heard my colleague, a great patriot as well, Representative Gaetz, mention this may not be a threat I got shivers down my spine, and I remembered something when I heard the former President Obama talk about ISIS as the JV team. Under this administration, we have wide open borders, and frankly, it is a direct security threat, and I am not comfortable taking our eye off the ball with an al-Shabaab that's well-funded, that has designs on killing Americans. This resolution, I do not believe, as a blanket statement, accomplishes very specific, targeted, time and event-based goals to keep Americans at home safe. Our troop presence in Somalia is small, serving primarily in a training role, has made critical national security gains, but also, as I'll mention again, I am a big Lions fan. And I learned growing up as a Lions fan that the reason we all knew the names of the offensive linemen is because our quarterbacks kept getting sacked. I learned very early that sometimes the best offensive linemen, the best small units, are the ones you never know their name. I believe that those nameless, faceless heroes all over the world, in corners that the administration has not justified in 22 years, deserve updated AUMFs with congressional authority and approval in order to justify their presence, putting their lives on the line at risk and being away from their families. We all agree that the way we are doing things is wrong and must be fixed. Now, let's work together to fix it. We would not even be having this conversation if not for the courage of my colleagues to stand up and force the issue. So I want to personally thank you. I have to address Mr. Speaker, I'd like to personally thank my colleagues for forcing this debate. It's long overdue, and I'm excited to do well by our servicemen and women all over the country. I again, with that, call on my colleagues to please join me in opposition to this resolution and commit to working with all of our colleagues to make sure the administration wants to send our men and women into harm's way. They better doggone well come to Congress first. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to the order of the House of Wednesday, April 26, 2023, the previous question is ordered on the concurrent resolution. The question is on the adoption of the concurrent resolution. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those in favor say no. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Gentleman from Florida.
I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote of the yeas and nays will rise.